Miss Catherine Mershon's oration today on Prudent or Prudish, a call for innocence and modernity. Now, as you either know from experience or you will soon know from experience, there's always a risk when it comes to making thesis topic choices. Right? And one of the biggest risks, right, is that you choose a question that's deeply personal and try to resolve it in an abstract way. Right? You want to convince so-and-so that she should date you, so you decide to write a thesis on what Catholic femininity really means. Dedicated to you-know-who, right? And in those kind of really concrete, practical theses, there's always going to be a tension and a risk of falling short. So when Catherine first came and she said, I want to write about whether I should go to movies with Graham Harrison, I mean, there's a real risk, or something like that. If you don't remember the conversation quite like I do, don't worry, you will. All right. So there's this real the risk that you're going to answer that question in a way that in the end leaves you unsatisfied, and you're so conflicted with so many personal things that are bound up with it that it's maybe hard to think clearly about the question. And so that was, watching Catherine work through the semester and go back and forth and have these deep conversations within her heart between her and Graham Harrison or other people. Again, this, if you don't remember it quite like this. Okay, great, yes, right. Anyway. But at the end, Catherine ended up producing, I think, a fairly marvelous thesis, working through the question at a kind of universal, principled way. What do we do when it comes to the question of preserving this virtue of innocence? And I could say all sorts of things about it, but she can say it so much better, and so I am delighted to introduce to you Miss Catherine Mershon.
Thank you all for coming. I very much appreciate it. Let's begin with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Take, Lord, and receive all my liberty, my memory, my understanding, and my entire will. You have given me all that I have and all that I am. I give it back to you to be disposed of according to your good pleasure. Give me your love and your grace. With these I will be rich enough and will desire nothing more. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Close your eyes and imagine you're in the following situation. It's Friday night and your friends have invited you to go to the movies with them. Well, that sounds like fun, and you didn't have any better plans anyway. But first you look up the parents' guide online. One movie is reported to be full of bad language and violence, but other than that, it's completely clean. Do you go? Another is supposed to have lots of dirty jokes and sexual innuendos, but it's supposed to have a great storyline. And let me tell you about the cinematography. That's fine, right? A third depicts the horrors of murder and depression very realistically. That's just real life. Evil exists, right? But you're sensitive to what you see and would rather not watch that. But what would your friends think? There can't be something wrong with every movie in the theater. Maybe they'll just think that you're a squeamish, better-than-thou goody two-shoes. Or worst of all, maybe you're a sheltered homeschooler. You make up your mind. Nah, it's probably fine if I go watch whatever it is they're watching. Next scene. Now you're at a dance, and you've been having fun, and there's been some good music and good dancing. But now it's getting late and dark, and the dance floor is quickly becoming a conglomerate of flapping limbs and swaying hips and bobbing heads. Someone rushes up from behind you and tries to pull you on the dance floor with them. Come dance! You object, showing your obvious disapproval of this so-called dancing. Oh, come on, they're just having fun. Don't be such a buzzkill. And they rush off, leaving you uncomfortable and agitated. There is a derogatory idea of innocence that is prevalent, especially in the current secular world. Innocence is ignorance. Someone with an innocent worldview is dubbed as inexperienced, naive, lacking worldly wisdom, maybe just immature. It is almost always used in this derogatory sense, except perhaps when said of children or in a court of law to indicate not guilty. In sacred scripture, however, innocence is never used in this derogatory sense, and is only ever used to connote some sort of goodness, righteousness, godlikeness. What then is the discrepancy between the modern use of innocence and the use in sacred scripture? Where did this modern use come from? What is innocence? And why should you care? In this oration, I am not going to try to give you particular answers to particular questions, but I will lay down some principles by which I hope you can better make such decisions for yourself. To do this, my oration will be in 4 parts. Firstly, I will describe what original innocence is according to Pope St. John Paul II, and fallen man's participation in that original state. Secondly, I will explain how modernity came to this derogatory sense of innocence. Thirdly, how to preserve it, even in this modern world. And fourthly, the errors to be avoided in that regard. So let's begin. In his Theology of the Body, Pope St. John Paul II says, in your first quote, "We can say that inner innocence, that is, the rightness of intention, in the exchange of the gift, consists in a reciprocal acceptance of the other, in such a way that it corresponds to the very essence of the gift. In this way, the mutual gift creates the communion of persons." End quote. In the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve were able to perfectly accept each other because they had the perfect intention to treat each other as gifts from the Creator. And more broadly speaking, they were able to do this with all of creation, to treat it as gift. The Pope continues in your second quote, "Innocence of heart, and as a consequence, innocence of experience, signifies a moral participation in the eternal and permanent act of God's will. That is, the act of gift-giving and receiving." End quote. This is an innocence of heart that leads to innocence of experience. It is as much an interior state as an exterior state. If original innocence referred to nothing more than the time before man fell, there would be no possibility of fallen man participating in this original state. But as the Pope says, it is an interior reality expressed exteriorly. With this understanding, then, of original innocence as this mutual, perfect reciprocity of gift, we can turn to fallen man's participation in this gift. When Adam and Eve sinned, it effected 2 changes. Firstly, he became experientially guilty of sin. And secondly, when Satan tempted Eve He introduced doubt into her heart that was hitherto unknown to her. In your third quote, the Pope says, "The biblical description of the fall seems to highlight particularly the key moment in which, in man's heart, doubt is cast on the gift." End quote. That is, it is the moment that man becomes suspicious of the complete givenness of creation, the moment he begins to suspect God of dishonesty. With these two effects of sin comes shame. Shame is caused by an interior knowledge that expresses itself in exterior reality. So in this instance, Adam and Eve feel shame and clothe themselves. The Pope says, in your fourth quote, "Adam has shame not so much of the body, but more precisely of concupiscence." End quote. Thus, man feels shame in two ways. He feels shame on account of having committed evil deeds and on account of his tendency toward committing evil deeds. Thus, shame is an unrest of conscience and sense of humiliation that's rooted in fear and is caused by the knowledge of concupiscence, that is, man's tendency toward evil. Now, it might seem that this knowledge of evil and the state of innocence are diametrically opposed. However, it is in fact the very awareness of man's tendency toward evil that allows him to keep himself from committing this evil. Pope St. John Paul II explains this in your fifth quote, "In relation to this consciousness of the body, shame is a secondary experience. While on the one hand it reveals the moment of concupiscence, at the same time it can provide weapons ahead of time against the consequences of concupiscence. One can even say that through shame, man and woman almost remain in the state of original innocence." Through shame, man and woman almost remain in the state of original innocence. End quote. Your sense of shame at doing evil things keeps you from doing evil things. Your distaste for certain movies, certain jokes, certain people, certain circumstances is a guard that protects you against evil. In his Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle explains this point as well. In your sixth quote, "Shame is not properly spoken of as a virtue, since it is more like a feeling than a state of character. It is not characteristic of a good person, since it arises from bad actions, but it is appropriate only to youth. For we think that young people should be properly disposed to feel shame, because they live by feelings and so make many errors, but are restrained by shame." End quote. Shame is not a virtue. In fact, as the Pope says, it indicates the threat to the value of innocence. But, as the Pope also says, it preserves this innocence in an interior way, because we are restrained by shame. In his divine providence, God uses the very mark of sin that is in each man as the very means by which he can overcome that sin. As Mary replaces Eve as the new mother of the living, as Jesus replaces Adam as the new man, as the tree of the cross that brings life replaces the tree in the garden that brought death, and as the most despicable act of mankind, that is the crucifixion of our Lord Jesus Christ, is transformed into the most glorious means of man's redemption in the resurrection, so too is the very effect of sin in each man, that is shame, the very means by which he can overcome his fallen state. So in this first part, we see two things. Firstly, that the original state of innocence was a perfect reciprocity of gift giving and receiving, and that guided by shame, fallen man can participate in this original state. Now in the second part, I will explain how this derogatory idea of innocence in modernity came about. In modernity, we no longer use shame as a guard to restrain us, as Aristotle says, but instead are ashamed of our shame. We are embarrassed to tell someone why we don't want to go to this movie, or why we don't want to go and be with these people, etc. This idea of shame was ushered in by Enlightenment thinkers who never move past the shame of concupiscence to the use of shame as a protection. In his second discourse, Rousseau's purpose is to show what man would have been like had God not interfered, and man had remained in the state of nature. His conclusion is as follows, in your seventh quote: "If it is true, as I believe I have proved, that only after many centuries could man have had the desire and opportunity to leave that state of nature, it would be a fault to find with nature, and not with him who would have been so constituted by nature." End quote. It is a fault with the creator of nature, not with him who would have been so constituted by nature. Ultimately, Rousseau and other like-minded thinkers deny that man fell of his own free will and instead posit that he was created in a fallen state. In other words, it's God's fault that man has problems. Even before Rousseau, Milton realizes that to reject creation as gift is to reject innocence. In Paradise Lost, Satan wishes that he had been made, quote, some inferior angel, so he would have been unburdened of the debt immense of endless gratitude, end quote. He cannot bear the debt of gratitude of this gift. These thinkers thrust their accusations on God. Had you not given this gift, we would not have rejected it. But as Milton's Satan shows, this leads only to eternal damnation. Pope St. John Paul II says that these Enlightenment thinkers realize the concupiscence of man's heart, but, quote, your eighth quote, they limited themselves to putting this heart in a state of continual suspicion, end quote. The modern world stops at suspicion and doubt, failing to hope beyond to something beyond man's concupiscible state. If then original innocence is this perfect reciprocity of gift, and fallen man can participate in that gift through guided by shame, and if the modern world rejects the idea of creation as gift in its entirety, there is no foundation for true innocence in modernity, and we are left only with the derogatory sense in which man tries to rid himself of his shame. So thus far we have seen, first, that original innocence is a perfect reciprocity of gift-giving, both an interior and an exterior reality, and that fallen man can participate in this guided by shame. And that, secondly, modern man rejects creation as gift, and therefore rejects this innocence. Now I will show in the third part how, even in this modern world in which we've rejected creation as gift, we can obtain and maintain this virtue of innocence. And then fourthly, the errors to be avoided in this regard. The preservation of innocence entails different amounts of knowledge for different people. It might look more like ignorance for some, and more like shamelessness for others. That is, like all virtues, it is relative to oneself, relative to one's state in life. For example, a father might have more knowledge of the evils of the world than a mother who is at home. A lawyer might have more knowledge of evil than a farmer in the country, and a priest certainly has more knowledge of evil than I do as a student. In these, and in every case, interior innocence can be maintained by a careful watch over what one allows into and what is proceeding forth from one's heart. In his spiritual classic, The Soul of the Apostolate, Dom Jean-Baptiste Choutard says that there are 11 truths that all men must hold as absolutely certain. The 8th is as follows. It is your 9th quote. My interior life will be no better than my custody of heart. Before all things, keep a guard over thy heart, for from it springs forth life. This custody of the heart is simply a habitual, or at least a frequent anxiety to preserve all my acts as they arise from everything that might spoil their motive or execution. It is a peaceful, unexcited anxiety without any trace of strain, yet powerful because it is based on childlike confidence in God. It is a work of the heart and the will, rather than of the mind, which has to remain free to carry out its duties. Far from being an impediment to activity, the custody of the heart perfects activity by ordering it to the Spirit of God and adjusting it to the duties of our state in life. End quote. Custody of the heart is peaceful and unexcited, as the Pope says that purity of heart necessitates a tranquil conscience. It is a work of the heart and the will rather than of the mind, which has to be remain free to carry out its duties. This habitual work of the heart and will guards against evil and preserves the good. This is the universal method by which all men can obtain and maintain interior innocence. It is akin to childlikeness and purity of heart, and it entails a trust in people, a trust in creation, and ultimately a trust in God. It is a habit of seeing the good first, and then, therefore, being able to participate in that original state of innocence by being able to give and receive that gift. It is the state guided by shame and one in which one is then able to take pleasure in the beautiful. So in sum, custody of heart can preserve interior innocence in every case. Now, transitioning to the fourth and final part, custody of the heart can go wrong in two ways. Firstly, by its excess, and secondly, by its absence. To properly practice custody of heart, one must know one's own tendencies, either toward ignorance or to shamelessness, in order to know which way to pull that stick in order to find the virtuous mean in between. So first, for the absence of custody of heart. The absence of custody of heart leads to the vice of vain curiosity. In his Summa Theologiae, Thomas Aquinas says, in your 10th quote, "For the knowledge of truth, strictly speaking, is good, but it may be evil accidentally, by reason of some result. Either because one takes pride in knowing the truth, according to 1 Corinthians 8:1, knowledge puffeth up, or because one uses the knowledge of truth in order to sin." End quote. If you don't moderate this pursuit of knowledge correctly, then you can become accustomed to evil in habit, an internal habit, and then desensitized to it. I return to my common examples. You end up going to a movie because you're afraid of what your friends would think, and you allow yourself to be pulled onto the dance floor because you don't want to look like a prudish wallflower. This does not mean that people always do these things for bad reasons. But it is to say that if you become desensitized to evil too much in thought, then you become more likely to do evil in action. It is an improper internal habit of thought that leads to improper external action. Vain curiosity then entails improper knowledge of evil, desensitizes you to it, chips away at your shame that is supposed to protect you and accustoms you to sin. Now, that is not also to say that everything that desensitizes you is in every case bad. For example, comedy makes light of the evil and the base in man in order to break him out of his idealistic, unrealistic boxes. By placing the Reeve's Tale and the Miller's Tale after the Knight's Tale, for example, Chaucer first raises Eros to almost a divine level, and then immediately shows how ridiculous it is to treat physicality that way. This is one of many examples that not only justifies, but perhaps even necessitates comedy to a proper understanding of reality. There is a tension here between innocence and comedy, but they are not mutually exclusive. My claim about innocence is not as much about the object of evil as much as it is about one's disposition. Is not so much about the object of knowledge as it is about one's disposition toward knowledge. Innocence entails using things properly, seeking knowledge properly. If you read Chaucer with a proper custody of heart, you can maintain your innocence. So much for the absence of custody of heart. The second error regarding custody of heart is its excess. This leads ultimately to ignorance and is rooted in a fear of evil. This is the homeschooled stereotype, whose parents have such an inordinate fear of their child falling into the lusts of the world that they paint an unrealistic picture of reality to them. When their child asks what certain words mean, they evade the question and instead just say, "Gay just means happy." This is a false innocence and is ultimately just rooted in a fear, an inordinate fear of evil, and also fails to see creation properly. Most people can probably think of real-life examples of children who are overly sheltered when they were young, and when they're older and actually experience the evils of the world, fall off into the other extreme. It's bad that man sinned, but the reality that he did must be addressed, not denied. The reason that children shouldn't read comedy isn't because comedy is bad. It's because they are still forming and practicing the virtue of innocence. Someone who has already achieved this virtue can read comedy with proper custody of heart and maintain that virtue. As one American author puts it in your 11th quote, "It is innocence when it charms us, ignorance when it doesn't." End quote. But of these two errors of custody of heart, it is much easier to lack it than to have it in excess. That is, it is much easier to know too much of the evil of the world than too little. This is because, regardless of one's motivations or one's actions, exposure to evil happens. If this exposure is dealt with properly when it does happen, there will be little to no need to ever have to seek it out. And further, if one makes a mistake, one cannot unsee, unhear, or unknow that object of knowledge. Even the Enlightenment thinker John Locke recognizes in your 12th quote, "Virtue is harder to be got than a knowledge of the world." End quote. Therefore, custody of heart dictates that it is perhaps not even good, but necessary to abstain from certain circumstances, watching certain things, being with certain people. And further, we ought to not only refrain from ridiculing others about this sensitivity, this shame of theirs, but even strive to protect it. Let me summarize. The original state of innocence, according to Pope John Paul II, is a perfect reciprocity of gift-giving and receiving. Enlightenment thinkers reject the idea of creation as gift in its entirety, and therefore reject the foundation for true innocence. We can regain this innocence in modernity through a proper custody of heart and proper self-knowledge in order to avoid the errors in that regard. In conclusion, then, innocence is not just a state of ignorance or naivety. It is a state in which, guided by shame, one maintains a trust ultimately in creation and in God. In a world saturated in sin and bombarded on all sides by temptations, it is difficult not to become wholly desensitized to evil. Therefore, a recovery of innocence is necessary for the understanding of a good cosmos, in which, though there is much evil, things are ultimately good. As Hopkins exclaims, "For all this, nature is never spent." We see the world clouded with eyes of evil, but to see creation properly, as gift and as good, we must instead see it with eyes of innocence. Thank you.
All right, well, we'll do questions from the panel first, then we'll open it up to the audience, and we'll start with Dr. Bolesnowski.
You would say that. All right. Let's talk TOB, right? Let's talk theology. Let's talk church. I think you're onto something with with this piece about shame. You've said a number of times, guided by shame. I want to push on that a little bit because I think John Paul II himself, maybe he's not explicit enough about this, but I think I'm going to say something that he really thinks, and I'll see how you react to it. I don't think shame is enough. I don't think you're claiming shame is enough. So I want to hear a little more from you on this. I think shame on its own, right, again, it kind of builds up walls, right, so we don't have any more incursions or don't hurt anyone else. But it seems to me that shame is actually on its own leads to despair, not to redemption. Okay? So with shame we realize I'm not a gift worth giving. I'm not someone who's worthy of receiving a gift. Why? I hurt people. I have hurt people. I will hurt people again. Other people are going to hurt me. So shame protects us in a certain way, but it's not enough to get to redemption. Mm-hmm. So fill that out for me. Show me how. What's the next step? How do I get through what John Paul II calls the historical man, right, to the redeemed man? Shame's a big part of that, but what do I need in addition to shame to get all the way there? How do I get out of that despair that shame would lead me to on its own into this kind of trust that you're talking about that leads to the true innocence?
This is the problem that the Enlightenment thinkers have. This is exactly what you're talking about, is that they recognize shame as this problem, the concupiscence of man's heart. Doubt is cast on the gift, and that's it. It's despair. It's tell me no more about creation is bad. I want to be my own God. All of that. To move past that, well, it takes the gift of faith and takes redemption. I mean, to use the idea is to use shame as a means of protection because there is something to protect, because there is a gift that is good that you should not have doubt about. Mm-hmm. So
where do you get that? How do you start thinking, oh, there's a gift worth receiving here, or I'm a gift worth giving? Or, that's a question I have for you. Where does that confidence come from?
And I can't just say God.
No.
Yeah.
Doesn't it come? Doesn't it have to do with perception, having been loved unconditionally, even though you're not worth loving?
Ultimately, that's from God. It's a recognition of goodness, a recognition that there is a gift, that creation is beautiful, that there's something good there to protect. Yeah, if you don't recognize that, it would lead to despair. I don't know, that's a choice you can make. You can choose between the goodness you see or just focus on, the shame of the fallenness.
I guess I'm thinking in terms of like just pedagogy, right? Like your parents didn't decide, I'm not going to pick up baby Mershon, baby Catherine because she's crying right now, right? There's something, you were loved,
Yeah.
right, by your parents.
Mhm.
And somehow, there, even at the natural level, there's this intuition. I've been loved despite the fact of all of this brokenness.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
So it kind of gets built in precognitively, pre-linguistically, and then it has to get reaffirmed to the Christian message of the incarnation of God, right?
Yeah. It seems like, yes, it has to start from somewhere outside of you,
Yeah.
which is, yes. So I suppose in the more particular, it's, your parents, your friends, whatever, someone who, probably your parents mostly, who have loved you. But it can't, that's why I say it's a gift. That's also a gift.
Right, exactly.
Not, because it doesn't just come from yourself. So, that allows you to move past, use shame properly to protect, what you recognize.
Right. Okay, great. Yeah, thanks.
And you stay.
Beginning, you were talking about, so return to the opening question, should I see the movie or not? And I'm thinking of, say violence. I'm wondering how reading a lot of the literature anyways that we read at the college in humanities, thinking of the Iliad, the Odyssey. I think you were in my class, we're reading some Ovid a couple of semesters ago, pretty violent scenes. How do we preserve the custody apart? You were talking about excess versus absence, where you could even say the same thing about the sacred scripture with violence, the passion. How do we understand that?
Yeah. Sort of as a side note, I think at least just in particular, with a lot of the books we read in our curriculum, at least in regards to violence, we're so accustomed to seeing violent things that I think that actually affects us a lot less than it would have in the past. Reading violent things doesn't have the same sort of effect on us to be too much evil.
Although we commonly see things on TV, but compare that with, say, ancient Rome, where you would see the gladiators and it was real. That was much more common. So it seems like we were a distance in a way from violence.
Yeah, the idea with custody apart is that, the innocence here is a spectrum, right? It's not just one line, one straight shot for everybody. It's a spectrum of that, is the two sides of it is too much, too little, but there's a place in between that you can be closer to, knowing too much or knowing too little, and still have innocence. I think this has to do with the desensitizing sort of thing and having a proper doubt. So, before the fall, man was not supposed to have any doubt about creation. It was good, it was perfect. But then when sin entered, there should be a proper doubt now of evil. Things aren't perfect anymore. So seeing these things, violence, reading about them in our curriculum, the Bible, all these things, they don't necessarily have to take away from the innocence that you can preserve, because you should have a proper doubt of creation, right? These things do exist, and we do have to realize that evil is a problem, right, to be addressed, not to be denied. How to do that? That's, I suppose you have to know, your own tendencies, and guard accordingly. You have to watch your motivations. That's the custody of heart thing, is that it's an interior motivation to guard guard against evil. So if we're reading Chaucer or Ovid or something, or things about violence because we want the thrill of it, or to scratch the itch of vain curiosity, as Augustine would say, then that's a problem. But it doesn't have to be. Does that answer your question? Okay.
All right. I wanted to ask about quote 10 when we're talking about this vice of vain curiosity. And there it seems like Aquinas is talking about vain curiosity as a motivation for knowledge within us, right? Either a motivation out of pride or some other end that we would use that knowledge for. And you compared that to going to a movie because of peer pressure. Is going to a bad movie going to a movie that I'm worried about and caving because of peer pressure the same thing as the vice of vain curiosity?
I don't think so. But I think it's it could be.
Okay.
It could be. I think that's something that leads to perhaps if you go to a movie because of peer pressure, that isn't saying anything else about what your interior motivations are. That's not to say that you want to use this knowledge for evil or because it's going to puff you up, like Thomas says. But if this is a mistake, if this movie actually ends up being bad and actually is, giving you too much, desensitizing you too much to evil, then it can lead to the vice of vain curiosity. So once you're exposed to evil and then you realize you realize the pleasure of this movie gave you or something, then after that, afterwards you might make an excuse of, oh, my friends are all going, it's probably fine, when your interior motivations actually are because of vain curiosity.
Sure.
Does that?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. That makes sense. Let me ask then one more follow-up question on terms of knowing my interior motivations. Sort of the response you gave to Magister. So what if? So let's pretend. Let's pretend we're at a school where lots of sheltered homeschoolers come. Okay? And in this hypothetical reality, some student comes that hasn't been exposed to violent or comedic literature. They enroll, and their first semester of freshman year, they're talking about impaled eyeballs and various things. And then they discover, whoa, I wasn't ready for that. So Nimi, I'm wondering, can you acquire this virtue of innocence of heart without in part losing innocence of heart?
So you're saying that it seems like if you come to this hypothetical school as a freshman and are exposed to evil things like this is something that's going to take away from your innocence in order to gain it.
Well, I guess, so in terms of knowing what your own internal motivations are and your own responses.
Yeah.
How do you know you respond badly to violent imagery if you've never seen violent imagery?
Okay, so I guess, yeah, you have to see it at some point. You have to see something. You have to be exposed a little bit. So, this is, again, it's the idea of proper doubt that so children are sort of like the state, not exactly, but sort of like the state of Adam and Eve before they fell, insofar as they don't have this, awakening of conscience yet, and they have no doubt about the goodness of creation. Adam and Eve weren't ever supposed to leave that state. Children in this fallen world are supposed to reach the age of reason, supposed to then be able to distinguish between good and evil, and to have a proper doubt, a doubt when it ought to be there about evil and about. So at some point, which I'm not going to say when, but at some point, probably if it hasn't happened by the time you're a freshman in college, then by that point, you have to be exposed to, in some regard, these sorts of evils, whether it's violence, etc. And if it's dealt with when it's exposed to properly, that's great. You won't have to seek it out. You won't have to be afraid of your interior motivations turning sour because you're talking about it in class with other people who all have the same desire for you. Like, we don't want to commit these sins. These are bad things. We're putting them, yeah, evil exists, but it's not a good thing. It's bad. And if you're, so if when you are exposed, it's dealt with in, you know, this kind of circumstance, that's going to be a way to cultivate your motivations to be good and not fall into vice of vain curiosity. Is that?
Yeah, so just as a summary, if you start reading the Iliad as a how-to book, stop.
Right, indeed.
Okay.
Right. Yes. If you, I mean, one more, I suppose also, if you read these things before you even have the ability to recognize, yeah, good and evil and such, then you're gonna just fall into, yeah, it's gonna become a how-to book or a, yeah, bad things.
I have kind of a general question. I'm not sure it's a good question. But I've probably studied Latin too much, and so I see everything through the lens of Latin. It in some ways can be a false cognate when I think about it historically. So in modern English, it means purity, or something to keep and preserve.
Yep.
But the original Latin root means not harming.
Yep.
So the active, passive versus active. I'm just kind of curious, does that fit in here anyways?
Yeah, I tried.
Thinking of some of the quotes, well, you don't have too many quotes from Latin authors, but if they use that word, they're probably thinking about that as well. I'm sort of thinking about it when I read it, maybe wrongly, but.
No, I think it does. Yeah, in noce, not harming. So this has to do. I think this corresponds to the exterior reality of innocence and the interior reality still, because if you're innocent of guilt, innocent of externally of doing something bad, then you haven't harmed someone else, right? That's the not harming of whether that be person, creation, whatever it is, not making it bad. And then I think interiorly you can say the same thing, that this is a not harming of yourself, of your own motivations and your interior disposition. So sins are in thoughts, words, and deeds, not just in deeds. And so the sort of not harming is, I think that goes along with this idea of creation is this good gift to be preserved. And so we don't want to harm it either externally or internally. Yeah, that's as much as I've sort of thought about that. Does that answer your question?
More questions?
Yeah, well.
You ask one more, and then we'll open up the audience.
Okay, sure, real quick. I think with that notion of innocence, you could see it applied to things instead of just people.
Yes.
It's an innocent pleasure, right? It's an innocent world even, right? One that doesn't cause harm. So that,
interesting, yeah.
yeah, so that you can take it out of the subject and put it into those objects. Maybe this is a softball, hopefully. I imagine someone will say, I have enough custody of heart. I could pretty much just go watch any movie and do it the right way. How do you respond to that person?
Evil offends God and should offend us. If it's not offending you, that's a problem. And if you think you have custody of heart in such a way that, if you think you have it, but you're not affected, not going to say like how much it needs to affect you, but at some point something needs to affect you and you need to not like it. There needs to be some sort of, no, this is bad, I shouldn't look at things this way, this is improper. And if someone does have custody of heart, there will be things that make them react that way. And if nothing does, and they can go watch anything without it fazing them, they're just desensitized to evil. And even if they're not doing it, they don't have even if they're not, committing sins, maybe not even in thought, I don't know, but not in action, they're not looking properly still, they're not seeing properly. It's still just a sort of, oh yeah, this exists. cruise control.
Yeah.
Uh,
Perhaps they haven't
Classic.
trained the affect properly, right? That we ought to feel a certain way.
Right.
In the presence of these things being represented.
yes, and which is why we shouldn't become wholly desensitized in that way.
Okay, great, thanks. That's
Audience. Do you want to tell them? Or-
Thank you. It was a great talk. So I was wondering, you said you cannot unsee, unknow, unhear
Yeah.
various evils. I'm sure we've all had experience with that. Is it possible to regain innocence after you've lost it? Because it seems like we always talk about that. And where something with like drunkenness, oh, I accidentally drink too many beers, or I intentionally drink too many beers, and now I'm drunk, but it's gonna go away. And it's not like I've lost sobriety for life, but it's,
Yes.
but it seems like we talk about that way with innocence, like I lost
Yep.
my innocence when I did X.
So I think it's not like sobriety in that way. It's not just, oh, it'll just fade off and you'll have it again. But I don't think it's to say that you can't ever regain it either. I think it's probably a lot more difficult because if you become really desensitized to things and don't have any sense of shame that you're then seeing past to preserve the good, it's going to be a work in progress, not just, oh, I'll sleep it off, right? Like if you're drunk. I think you can work toward that. But that's also why I said that innocence is like a spectrum, right? You can be like working on the habit, the internal habit of it, trying to preserve custody of heart, trying to see things properly, but not have like the visceral reaction we were just talking about or something, and actually not be fazed by things, but realize you should be. And in that case, it's at least it's part of the virtue. You know, it's on the way to the virtue. It's on the way to having this habit that you don't have to think about. You know, that's within the intellectual. It's not really just habitualized yet, but you can recognize that you need it and work on it in that way, I think, to regain innocence. Maybe not as perfectly as if you hadn't lost it. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Dr. Olson?
When talking about custody of heart, I believe you said improper habit of thought leads to action.
Leads to improper external action,
Right.
yes.
And that established in my mind a connection between heart and mind.
Uh-huh.
But then you also want to distinguish between heart and mind. I wonder if you could define for me heart as distinct from mind.
So usually when I'm talking about heart, I'm just meaning motivation, trying to refer to something interior as opposed to something perhaps conceptualized. You're talking about the relation between them. Yes, is that what you're asking about?
I guess I want to know what is heart as distinct from mind? Part of my question is, I'm not sure about this, maybe the panel can jump in here. I suspect Thomas never uses the word heart when talking about these things. So he had some other way of thinking about where this thing or whatever it is you're trying to get at existed in the human, how it was in the psyche, where it was in man.
Yeah.
The word heart feels very modern, and I
Yeah.
just don't know what it means.
Right, yeah, that's, I guess, does Thomas talk about it more in the appetites, talking about the virtues being in the appetites?
Yeah.
As opposed
Would this
to-
be the animus?
Yes,
Is
it's sort of a blend of things going on there, right? In some ways, it's probably an older term than a newer term, right?
biblical.
Biblical, Augustine will use it.
Heart.
Yeah. Aquinas uses it occasionally.
So
different
core,
Obviously,
so
he's trying
animus,
to
or?
get
Or-
at something
yeah.
that's real.
Yeah,
Obviously that, yeah, so that's granted, but what is it?
Is she still asking what it's saying?
Yeah.
I think at least how I'm trying to use it, I can't say how Pope John Paul II is trying to use it, but is to mean interiority, motivation, which is some sort of, something deep down in the psyche. I don't know how else to
Not in the mind?
pinpoint it. So the heart is going to lead, I mean, it is, it's connected to the mind, and it's, but it's not conceptualized, or it's not primarily, like it could be also in the mind, but heart I don't think necessitates that.
It's a strange word because we obviously don't believe this thing is in the heart.
Literally, of course.
Yeah. So it's sort of like we're using the word because we don't know where it is. Is that what's happening? I mean, where would it be if not in the mind? I guess that's what I'm
in the habit. I mean, are you talking like when I don't know. Maybe I'm thinking about it improperly, but when I think of and it's, this quote from Dom Chittard also is talking about how it's in the heart and the will, not in the mind, which has to remain free to carry out its duties, right? So it's internal, it's habitual, it's something you're not thinking about. This perfect state of innocence is not something you're constantly having to remind yourself, oh, I saw this, oh, make sure I see the good in this, not the evil. It's just a thing you do, right? And that's what virtue is ultimately. But, so in that way, it's in the heart and will, just something you do, not something you constantly have to be thinking about, conceptualizing. Distinct in that way. I don't know if I can pinpoint heart any more than that, but is that a beginning of an answer?
I think so, yeah.
Okay. Will?
So I'm on board with the fact that we can become desensitized by witnessing too much evil, but can't we be desensitized in another direction? Meaning that we've either seen or committed an atrocity so many times that we realize that this is in fact the wrong way to go about things.
Can't you become desensitized by doing evil too much?
Mm-hmm. You become disenchanted after you said so many jokes or realize that, hey, maybe this sexual thing isn't working out and finding my happiness. We're desensitized to the attraction of evil.
Desensitized. So you're asking, can you do evil so much that you actually realize that's a bad thing, and in that way it leads you back toward innocence somehow?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I think so. It can at least make you recognize that these evil things aren't the thing you're looking for. I don't know if that's going to turn you toward the solution, which is seeing creation properly and trying to cultivate custody of heart. So I don't know that it will necessarily turn you to the right thing, but yes, I think that you can commit so much evil that you become disenchanted with it. It's no longer pleasurable. Yes, that's not the ideal, and we shouldn't try to do that. You're obviously not saying that, but yes.
But isn't that better than never having a temptation in the first place?
Than never having the temptation in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Well, the person who's never really been tempted to evil before, I wouldn't really give him that much credit as a good person. But the guy who's had a temptation and overcome it, preferably you'd overcome it not by having done it in the first place, but by just encountering the temptation, he's in a better state than the person who's never been tempted.
I understand that, part of me wants to say yes to that, but the greatest in the kingdom of heaven is a child, and the virgins are the ones that are the highest, and the people that haven't sinned, haven't gone down that path, been tempted, fallen, and returned, that's better. It's always better not to sin. It's always better. It wasn't, yeah, I'm not.
True, I think the person who's never sinned and also has been tempted is the best.
Maybe everybody's tempted, though, also. Are you trying to distinguish that from someone not ever being tempted? Because I don't.
Right, or never really confronting evil in that way.
Maybe. I don't think I have.
Are you understanding, just so I'm clear between the two of you,
Yeah.
are you understanding tempting here just to see the attractiveness of doing evil? Is that what we mean?
Yeah, you're talking about being attracted to evil by temptation?
Yeah, I think that's what temptation is.
So that then, in that case, you're suggesting that there's a kind of moral strength in seeing evil as beautiful is a greater moral strength than never seeing evil as beautiful?
I suppose seeing evil as beautiful and being able to move past it and realizing that it's not is a better thing because it helps you understand the good of it, creation better, helps you understand the good things better. Yes, that's probably true. Then, yes.
Thank you.
Well, on that note, we'll end. Yeah. So I think you just undercut your thesis. But all right, there you go.